Shalom, and welcome to the Jewish Geography Podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Eitan Levy. This week we're going to talk about whether Israel is a colonial state. That is, whether Israel is a state whose purpose is here to exploit the native population. We're also going to talk about another Middle Eastern people who is yearning to be free, and whether or not we should get behind them. So stay tuned, it's going to be really interesting. The Palestinians could have had a state at least 3 times. In 1948, had they accepted the UN partition plan, they would have a state. If they had accepted one of at least 2 generous, in my personal opinion, overly generous, Israeli offers in the early 2000s by 2 different Israeli prime ministers, they would also have a state right now. And from the Palestinian side, you'll hear arguments about why they don't trust us, how we don't keep our side of the bargain, etc. But still, why not make a deal? Why not accept a state on a silver platter delivered to you by the international community and bankrolled by the international community? The answer is that the Palestinians don't want a state, or rather, they don't want just a state. They want a state which encompasses all of what they consider to be Palestine, from the Jordan to the sea, as their state, and for that state to be Judenrein, that is, free of Jews. I'm not making this up. Just go and look at MEMRI, M-E-M-R-I. It stands for the Middle East Media Research Institute. It's a site where they show videos from Palestinian television and articles from the Palestinian media and translate them into English with usually little to no comment at all from them, just actual translations of what they say in Arabic. So go on there, MEMRI, and click around on their site for a while. Watch clips of PA politicos talking about their goals, about their support for terror, about their hope to eventually destroy Israel, regardless of whether a peace deal is reached or not. Now, given the amount of suffering their intransigence has caused, why don't they decide to make peace and compromise with the Jews? There may be a lot of reasons, but the reason I see gaining the most currency among supposedly progressive supporters of Palestine in the West is this idea of Israel as a colonial power. As Hanin Zouabi, a member of the Israeli parliament and a rabid anti-Israel fanatic, said recently, as a colonial power, any act of violence against us is legitimate. Our very existence here is illegitimate, and therefore any violence against any of us, even civilians, is justified. And even acts of apparent self-defense, of shooting a terrorist with a knife as she or he is trying to kill you, is illegitimate. Because if the Jews here are just a colonial power, just like the French in Algeria, if we are just here to subjugate the local people and extract resources for our foreign masters, then we are indeed so evil that we have no rights here, including the right to live. So, even assuming you accept the basic premise about the morality vis-a-vis occupiers and occupied, why is that view wrong? Isn't it true that most of us came from Europe? Well, actually, no. Maybe about half of us came from Europe. The other half came from Muslim lands in the Middle East, Morocco, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, etc. But didn't the European colonialists run the project? That is, Ben Gurion and other people of Polish nationality who came to the land of Israel. Well, how do you define a colonialist? Usually, it's someone in a foreign land at the behest and at the service of another nation somewhere else. Their goals are usually to extract wealth and resources for the enrichment of their home country. They usually implant their foreign language in the new land and maintain strong economic ties and military ties with the home country. So how do those European Jews who fled here to Palestine, or the land of Israel, stand up? Well, for one, they came in spite of their home countries, not because of them, mostly fleeing as refugees. Secondly, they did not extract wealth to send back to somewhere else, but rather extracted wealth from their brethren around the globe in order to build up the country here. So the most very basic definition of colonialism, which is people from one place in another place sending things back to support the home country, is not even vaguely, remotely met in this case. But this all ignores the most obvious reason why we're not a colonial state, and that is that we are native to this country. We have thousands of years of history in these hills, attested to in the best-selling book in the world, and recounted by countless children year after year all over the world. Here is where the seasons match the rhythm of our ancient holidays, which in some cases are made ridiculous and in others actually impossible to perform in much of Europe or North America simply due to the weather. Have you ever tried to sit in a sukkah out in the snow in the winter in Boston? So here is where our historic forebears are buried, just a short drive from where I sit now, recording this message. Hebron, where Abraham is buried, is attested to by the local tradition of the Arabs as well, and it's near at hand. Tekoa, where I live, where I'm sitting right now, here on the edge of the Judean desert, was the home of Amos the prophet. We are not colonialists, coming here to export resources back to enrich some foreign power. We are a native people exercising our right to live and be the masters of our own destiny in our own homeland. And the Palestinian terror proto-states, the PA in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, are coming up against something which is defying their understanding of reality. Unlike the French in Algeria, we are not breaking because we are home. And we are not running away because, literally, we have nowhere else to go. And we are not backing down because our desire to live will not be shamed by their lies and propaganda. Every innocent they kill only hardens our resolve. Every offer they reject hardens our hearts. And every day that goes by ensconces us more and more on the land they claim for their state. If I was a Palestinian, I would be begging my government to take a deal for a state. Any deal. Because if the idea of a Palestinian state isn't dead already, and the good money is on the idea that it is, it's on life support. For 2,000 years, the Jewish people wandered the earth, uprooted from our homeland and denied a national expression of our peoplehood. After the Holocaust, we seized the moment and, through war and conflict, re-established ourselves in the land of Israel. Today, there is another ancient Middle Eastern people who are denied independence. These people have been slaughtered en masse in living memory, and are now in possession of land and weapons which they hope to parlay into an official state. The Kurds are mostly in a contiguous area that spreads over the borders of 4 countries: southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, northern Syria, and northwestern Iran, with most of those being in Iraq and Iraq and Turkey. They're mostly Sunni Muslims, but they're not Arabs. They have a distinct culture, a distinct national history, a different language that they speak. This nation of between 20 and 40 million people has now established what is effectively an independent state in Iraq around their capital in Erbil, some 1/4 of historic Kurdistan. Despite the fecklessness of the West in confronting ISIS in general, and tepid support of the Kurdish armed forces in particular, they have been the only force which has consistently stood up to these barbarians with any level of success. They are the only reason the fighting in Iraq didn't make its way to Baghdad, and instead gave the Iraqi army time to regroup and work up enough gumption to at least hold their lines against ISIS. Today, Iraq is not a failed state. It is a state that simply does not exist. What used to be Iraq is now at least 3 distinct nations. There is the Shia-dominated area in the south, which is where the government that the international community refers to as the Iraqi government sits, based in Baghdad. The north of the former country is split into an ISIS territory, a majority Sunni area which will never be reunited with the Shia-dominated south except by outside force, and Kurdistan. Let's refer to the Sunni area as Sunnistan, because I'm not going to assume that ISIS is going to be around forever, but the area is going to continue being Sunni. So while the Kurds are essentially functioning as the only reliable ally of the West in that theater of war, and have been functioning as an autonomous nation de facto for years already, why are their national aspirations being ignored or quietly torpedoed by the US and other Western governments? There are 2 reasons that I see, 2 main reasons. One is a nation, one which is very important in the region and happens to be a member of NATO. The other reason is the supposed sanctity of international borders. Let's discuss these one at a time. Turkey was long ruled by a secular regime, which was democratic off and on. Occasionally, whenever non-democratic rulers would get into power, the army would take over and reinstall secularists, and then they would have another election, and the secularists would rig things so that they would win. But they sided with the free world during the Cold War, becoming a member of NATO. Under the current Prime Minister, Erdogan, Turkey has taken a decidedly anti-democratic and Islamist turn. Formerly Israel's best friend, if passively, in the region, where Israeli businesses built factories and Israeli tourists would travel by the tens of thousands, the relationship between us today is, at best, precarious, and has recently gone through a period with no diplomatic ties, though, of course, the economic ties continued because money doesn't care about politics. Turkey's territory is populated by 15 to 20 million Kurds who want to be part of Kurdistan, not part of Turkey. And Turkey is afraid that if a Kurdistan is created just over their border, the pressure from this area to secede will be even stronger, and given material support. It's a legitimate concern for Turkey, especially since Kurdish separatists have engaged in terrorist activity in the past. Although they've forsworn it now, it's a legitimate fear. But I don't see it as a good enough reason to deny the Kurds a state. For one reason, because Turkey is not a positive actor in the region anymore. Let them be upset. And also because you don't deny one people justice in their country because another country is upset about it. Starting to sound analogous to any other Middle Eastern countries to you? The second reason, and I think the more salient point here, the more relevant one, is that international law post-World War II has essentially sanctified international borders and frozen them in time. In principle, this is supposed to mean that wars over land and borders should stop because any changes in those lines will be overruled by the international community. But in practice, this is just empty verbiage, just as never again has been to the numerous peoples genocidally destroyed in the last 70 years, for whom the world did nothing, or rather did nothing until it was over. It has become, never again, if it's easy to stop, and if we can get all the big players to agree, and if we don't have to fight a real war over it, and if they don't have a powerful country protecting them. So too with borders. We're afraid that if we allow the democratic will of the people in these regions to split the nation of Iraq into more than one country, this desire to secede will spread and cause havoc in neighboring countries, or even distant ones. Just like how, in Scotland, the world community intervened to prevent a vote happening that might have let Scotland secede from the UK. Oh, wait. That totally didn't happen. I guess when white Europeans want to split up a country along historical and ethnic lines over small issues like levels of taxation and other first world problems, that's their business. They have democratic rights. But when a small nation of dark Middle Eastern people wants to secede from a country which has often murdered them en masse, ignored their interests entirely, or at best left them alone to take care of themselves against murderous enemies, we can't allow that. That will tear apart the fabric of the system of nation-states. Ongoing war and suffering, trying to stick Humpty Dumpty together again, is preferable to letting these people be the masters of their own destiny. And what's even more ridiculous about it is that they are, for all intents and purposes, already an independent state. They have their own government, their own economy, their own foreign policy, which is notably friendly to Israel, and a domestic policy notably devoid of anti-Semitic rhetoric. And most importantly, for this part of the world, they have their own army, which, despite being under-equipped and underfunded, intentionally, by the West, has proven themselves a match for foes who sent the Iraqi army, who was generously equipped and trained by the United States, sent them packing in a day. When the war with ISIS is over, and Sunnistan is being run by a coalition of neighboring states, UN troops, the Iraqi government, and God knows who else, make no mistake that the international community will try to deny the Kurds their state. It's too uncomfortable for the West to recognize this level of self-determination for people in this part of the world. They can vote, but only in the political units, the states, we created out of whole cloth 100 years ago. They can play the game, but we determine the shape of the board. And this attempted disenfranchisement will come when the world is morally indebted to the Kurds for helping stop ISIS, or the Islamic State, or ISIL, or whatever you want to call it. So I want to get the ball rolling now on a movement to let Kurdistan be free. Free from Shia overlords in Baghdad, free from Turkish and Iranian interlopers, and free to determine their own destiny, free to be a beacon of relative modernity and religious moderation in a region that sorely needs both. That's all for this week's episode of Jewish Geography. I'm your host, Rabbi Eitan Levy, and if you want to learn more about me or hear past episodes or subscribe, go to rabbieitan.com. That's RABBIEITAN.com. Check it out. I've got lots of links, reviews, stories, information about hiring me for a tour. That's my day job. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe or go to iTunes and leave a review. That would be really helpful. Thanks, and I'll see you next week. In the meantime, take care.